pleasure to be here and speak to all of you and to our internet audience as well. I know I have a bit of a challenge right now talking to you in this after lunch slot when everyone might be a little sleepy, so I've tried to bring pictures and videos of cute children to keep you entertained. So today I'm going to be talking about picky eating, children's food acceptance, and what parents can do about this. Now, there's a few words in here that always come up as questions. So you've heard already a little bit about feeding practices. So these are the concrete behaviors that parents can do and strategies they can take to manage what, when, how much their children are eating. And you've heard about some of them already and some of the potential consequences of those. But then we have this term picky eating, and we've had some questions already about picky eating and what is picky eating. And I'll tell you it's a bit of a challenge because there is no formal definition of picky eating. In the literature, every study defines it a little bit differently, it makes it very difficult to compare across studies. So there's no formal definition. Generally, how studies ask about picky eating is it's based on a parent's perception of their child. So they say, is your child a picky eater? And the parent, usually the mother, has to interpret this question and say, what is picky eating? Does this apply to my child? And if you think about this about your own child or even yourself, it's not even so clear. You know, what does that mean to be a picky eater? Is this relative to other people? Is this about today or last week or in general? And whatever picky eating is, it does seem to be a source of stress for families, that parents worry about how much their children are eating, what their children are eating, that they're not getting enough energy or vitamins. And so they're looking for solutions and ways to help their children to eat the right foods. So the next question is, how common is picky eating? And again, this is going to depend on how you define it. And so this is, again, a bit of a challenge. So we just did a study in China, and we asked parents, is your child a picky eater? And so when you ask the question this way, you find out it's about 1/3 of Chinese 2-year-olds are picky eaters. Okay, so it's quite common, one in 3 children. But if you ask the question just a little bit differently, so my colleague did a study in the US, and they gave 3 options. So the choices are, is your child a picky eater? You can say no, they're a little bit picky, or they're very picky. And when you ask it this way, if you ask about the whole picky eating group, you get a similar proportion of 34%. But when you look at only the very picky kids, this goes down to 10%. So this is a much smaller portion of the population. Some studies ask about whether, compared to other kids the same age, is your child picky. So it may be that if you have a 2-year-old, you say, yes, my child is picky, but all 2-year-olds are picky, and maybe you're not concerned about this. And then nowadays, there's a bit more of a trend to, instead of asking parents, is your child a picky eater, you ask them a series of questions from a questionnaire or a subscale of a questionnaire that ask more about the specific behaviors of the child, which lets you be a little bit more objective. So these could be questions like, is your child difficult to please with foods? Do they enjoy a wide variety of foods? Or your child decides that they don't like something before they even try it, okay? So this can sometimes help to take the burden of definition off of the parent, and then the experimenter can instead make a score from that and decide. Now, I have some good news. So I have a lot of good news, actually. But the first good news is that most children grow out of picky eating. So as you've heard from the previous speakers, this is a phase that a lot of children go through. It tends to peak around ages 2 to 4, so kids go through a picky eating phase. But most kids grow out of this. It passes. So even though this can be stressful, that parents may worry during this period of the child's life, in most cases, it does pass. Now, when I show this slide, the first question I usually get from parents is, well, my child's 6 and they still don't like this food. Okay? Or, I am in my 30s, 40s, 50s, 70s, and I still don't like this food. Is it too late? Have I missed the window? And the answer is no. More good news. Adults can learn to like new foods too. So pay attention, some of these tips may work for you too. So from my own personal experience, there's a lot of foods I didn't like growing up that are quite typical for little kids. I didn't like coffee, fish, or certain vegetables like fennel, which we heard about earlier. So if you think about coffee, a lot of people don't like coffee the first time, right? But you come to like it with time, and we'll talk about how some of these tips can apply to some of these things as we get older. Okay, So when we think about picky eating, so I said, okay, there's no formal definition of picky eating, so what are we talking about? And so recently, my colleagues and I, we did a review, and we looked through the literature to find out what behaviors tend to be associated with picky eating, okay? And where do we have more objective evidence that there is a difference between picky eaters and non-picky eaters, or more picky and less picky eaters? And what we came up with was that they might avoid trying new foods, this neophobia we heard about earlier. Picky eaters tend to eat a limited range of foods. They might refuse foods more often. They may have sensory sensitivities, and they may enjoy eating a bit less. And I've clustered these in groups. It's not just that I'm bad at spacing on my slide, but the reason I did this is that I'm going to talk about these behaviors in these groups in terms of what parents may be able to do to help address some of these different behaviors. So even though being neophobic and having a limited diet are very different behaviors, the solutions are similar. What we want to do is we want to introduce more foods into the diet in a way that they'll be accepted. So we'll talk about those together. So, as I've said, and so how can we introduce new foods into the diet? Well, as you've heard earlier, one really effective method is repeated exposure, right? So we know that kids who are exposed to a food several times are more likely to enjoy it as they try it more times. And this tends to be particularly effective in infants. So you've seen this graph earlier from Dr. Meyer, that infants, if they try a food 7 or 8 times, eventually they will come to accept it. This is my friend's daughter. She would eat anything you put on a spoon. And the great thing about this in infants is, like I said, you put something on a spoon, they have to take at least one mouthful before they realize what it is, and then they've had their taste. And even if they won't take a second spoonful that day, you can try again another day. Now, the challenge is when they get a little bit older. And then they can say no. And so a lot of my research has focused around what do you do when kids are over 1? We know that we need them to try something several times. How can we get them to taste the food again? And this is one of these techniques, like I said, that works for adults. So the first time you tried coffee, did you like coffee? It was very bitter, right? It's difficult the first time you try coffee, but you try it again, and you try it again. You know, for whatever reason, you need to study, your colleagues are having coffee and it's awkward not to, but you keep trying it and eventually it's okay, right? Same thing with several other adult beverages, right? And most of them don't taste good the first time, but you keep trying. Okay. And so the challenge is really getting to the second and third trial. And we may find that there's certain foods that we try once when we're a kid, we decide we don't like it, and you never taste it again. And so even as adults, maybe after 20, 30 years, it's time to give it another shot, and maybe it's not as bad as you remember. So sometimes it's easy to tell when a child likes a food. This is my new nephew trying applesauce for the first time. And he gives a big smile and a little eyebrow action. Okay. But as we've learned, this is not typical, right? You know, not all kids will give you such a clear cue that they like something. And sometimes they may do something that even looks like they don't like it at all because it's surprising, right? So think about the first time you try something or when you try something that's not what you thought it was going to be. When you think you're having mint ice cream and it's pistachio, you may make a face, right? Because it's not what you were expecting. So this is my friend's son having a sour yogurt for the first time. Okay, sour, right? You have this reaction to it. And so some moms would say, oh, he doesn't like this food. But look, he'll open his mouth for a second bite, a third one. So even though you know, this food was surprising, it's not that he's refusing it. And so we need to make sure that parents are aware that they should look more for whether they're willing to have a second bite than necessarily what's going on in their face. So a lot of the research both on picky eating and on feeding practices is really heavily based on parents' questionnaires, reports. And I don't want to say that parents lie to us, but parents may not be aware of all the behaviors that they're doing. They may not recognize them. They may not be aware of how often they're doing it. A lot of these things are quite reflexive. And what seems to be a lot for me may not be a lot for another mom. So what we've done for this study is we've actually observed parents in the home and how they're feeding their kids. And we're able to objectively code the parent's behavior and the child's behavior. So the way we did this was we sent video cameras to the homes of 60 families in the US with a baby between 12 and 36 months. And we asked them to videotape every time their toddler ate or drank for one day and send us the videos. And then a week later we said, okay, we want you to record one more meal and we'd like you to give your child a fruit or vegetable that they've never had before and record that and send it to us. And the reason we recorded these two different situations was that we wanted to see whether parents would use different techniques in this more challenging situation when the child's having an unfamiliar food. Because we thought, maybe during a regular day they feed foods that they know the kid will eat and there's no challenge. And we wanted to see which of these behaviors would be most successful in convincing the children to eat these foods. So the way we looked at this was once the parent told their child to eat something, we categorized it into a variety of different ways parents can prompt kids to eat. And we looked at whether the child ate the food that the parent asked them to eat within the next 20 seconds without saying no. Okay. So what works? So the most successful thing globally was modeling. We've heard a little bit about modeling earlier today. This is when the parent enthusiastically eats the food in front of the child. So we see that a neutral prompt, like try your peas, works about 40% of the time, and actually modeling was significantly better. And in this case, facial expressions are important. And when you think about little kids, so what a child who's learning to walk, for example, right? So learning to walk, they take their first steps, and they fall down. What's the first thing they do? They look at their mother, exactly. They look at mom, and if mom goes, you're okay, get up, they get up, and they try again. If mom looks worried, they cry, right? So kids are very sensitive to the parent's facial expressions to figure out how to react to a situation. So if you're feeding your child and you try the food, you go, carrots, have some carrots, you're gonna love this. The kid is gonna expect that they're going to like this food. But if you offer them a spoonful of food, you say, try the carrots, right? They're gonna say, well, why is this scary? Why does mom look worried? Should I be nervous? What's gonna happen to me? So it's really important that we use positive facial expressions, that if you don't like the food, you have to be a good actor. And also, it's not just the parents who can be good role models. We found actually older siblings were very effective role models. So this is my friend's older son demonstrating eating carrots for her younger son. But this only works if the older child likes the food, okay? If the older child likes the food, there's nothing that's cooler than being like your big brother or sister. But if the older child says, ew, peppers, gross, then nobody's gonna eat peppers. So you just have to be sure that your selected model will play well. So I'm gonna show another video of another situation where a child's eating a very sour food with a model. So this is a lime. And so mom is very worried about her and says, okay, maybe we should stop.
She's like, what did Papa do to me?
But then dad decides he'll model eating the lime.
Easy.
So he says, mmm. And he's sucking on the lime, and he passes it back to her, and she tries it again. And this time she's not surprised by it anymore, okay? So this is an effective way to get kids to try and to retry foods. Okay. What else works? So in our study, we also, after we recorded all these videos, a couple months later, we collected dietary intake data from these families, and we compared the families where the kids ate a lot of vegetables, or ate more vegetables, compared to the kids who ate less, to see what are the differences between the feeding practices these families were using. And the main difference actually was in their use of reasoning. So this was when parents told the kids, eat your carrots because they're good for your eyes, or eat this, it tastes delicious, or try this prune, it's like a big raisin. So they compare the food to something the kid already is familiar with. And this seemed to be really linked to these children eating these foods on a more regular basis. And the reason we think this is because this creates an intrinsic motivation to eat the food. So if you think about, if I say, make me, your mother, happy by eating your carrots, you might eat it while I'm here. If I say if you eat your carrots, you can have ice cream, you might eat it while I'm here, right? But if I leave the room, you have no reason to eat this food, right? But if I say if you eat your carrots, it'll make your vision better, okay? Then whether I'm here or not, you may choose to eat the carrots to have this benefit of the food. So it makes it so that the child inherently wants to eat this food, and it's not contingent on who's watching them. Now, we heard a bit earlier about using food as rewards, and in the literature, they talk a lot about this with these long-term consequences you heard about in the earlier talks, right? That if you use food as a reward, essentially if you say, if you eat your broccoli, you can have ice cream, you're communicating to your child that broccoli is bad and ice cream is good, right? And that in the long term, they'll like the broccoli less, because you keep telling them, I have to pay you to eat this. And so we kind of thought that in the short term it would work, right? Today I say if you eat the broccoli you can have ice cream, but then you'd have these long-term consequences. But actually in our sample we were very surprised to find that it doesn't work in the short term either. So when we offered a new food to the child, so this is when they had a fruit or vegetable they've never seen before, again a neutral prompt works about 40% of the time. Nothing works better. Reasoning, modeling, both very similar. But using a food reward was actually worse, okay? And the reason is, remember, these kids are quite young. They're between 1 and 3. And we think that the kids were so distracted by this reward and they don't really understand kind of the cause and effect yet. So they'd say, I want the ice cream now. And they say, no, you have to try the artichoke first. And then often there were tears, and it was game over. So it doesn't work. So we can just tell parents it doesn't work in the short term, it doesn't work in the long term. This is not a strategy that we should be adopting. We can skip this one, okay? All right, so what can we do beyond these kind of feeding practices? Well, another tactic we can use is we can mix flavors together. We can take a new food and we can combine it with familiar flavors that might make it better accepted so that the child will taste it. This would be things like adding toppings, a dip, serving vegetables together on the plate. I want to emphasize that I don't mean hiding vegetables. This is something we often hear, oh, well, you can like, blend them up into a hamburger and then they won't know that they had it. And it's true, they won't know that they had it. And if they don't know that they have it, you've taken away this learning opportunity, right? They don't know that they've eaten this food, they've tried it, they liked it, it was fine. They've lost this opportunity to have this kind of exposure to the food. So we want to make sure that the food is identifiable, that they can taste it, but that they're willing to try it. Now, if you're going to take this approach, one thing you may want to try is what we call fading. And this is when you start with the food together with, let's say, a dip or a topping, and you slowly use less of that extra food until you're eating the food plain. So in this example, if you're having broccoli with cheese on top, because a lot of kids like cheese, you can start with a lot of cheese, which makes it very exciting for kids. And then each time you make it, you could cook it with a little bit less cheese until eventually, maybe they're eating plain broccoli. Now, if the children are refusing foods or if they have sensory sensitivities, we would suggest that you look for patterns in the foods to see why they're having these refusals and maybe to see if there's a different way that those foods can be served to be more accepted. I found a very scientific source. I found an Instagram account called #MyKidCan'tEatThis and looked at some different reasons that parents said that their kids can't eat these foods. This is really small, but this mom says, my kid can't eat this because the flour on the bread makes her hands feel weird. This one says, my kid can't eat this because the juice is too wet. And this one says, my kid can't eat this because it's dirty. On Earth, we call this seasoning. And so in the next section, we'll talk about the different sensory properties of foods, the appearance, the texture, the smell, the taste, that can potentially make children avoid a certain food. So when we think about children avoiding foods, we tend to gravitate towards the taste and smell. And so these would be the obvious candidates. So if there's a very strong taste, particularly if it's bitter or sour, this can result in refusals. Similarly, we heard a little bit earlier about certain smells, particularly foods like fish and cheese, that these can be aversive to some children. And in this case, we might want to just find ones that are fish that smell a little bit less like fish, or cheeses with less pronounced smells. Also extreme temperature, foods that are either very hot, parents think about, but also foods that are very cold, that something like a popsicle that can hurt the kids' teeth, that can also be something that the children don't want to eat more of. In addition to the taste and the smell of the food, we're finding more and more that the texture may be a reason that foods are being avoided. That there's a lot of different ways you can prepare the same food, and this varies the taste and the texture of the food. Here we have 4 different variations of sweet potato. You can bake it, you can make a soup, you can make a puree, and the children may accept some of these and not others. So as you're thinking about doing your 8 to 10 trials of retrying a food, you can also try preparing it in a different way and see if a different version of that food is better accepted. For those of you who went to the breakfast buffet this morning, you might have noticed that they could make eggs in a dozen different ways. And there's a reason for that. Even though they're all just plain eggs, a hard-boiled egg is very different than a scrambled egg. It's different than a fried egg. That these have very different textural properties, and some people prefer one to another. There's a little bit of research that looks at what are children's preferences in terms of food preparation methods and textures. Some of them show that boiled and steamed vegetables tend to be better accepted than other cooking methods. In particular, these cook very evenly across the food. They don't brown the food, so you don't get any of these ununiform appearances like the seasoning on the chicken, right? That may be aversive to some kids. Some kids like foods that are crunchy, so even raw vegetables may be better accepted in some cases. Now, beyond, when we think about texture, this is usually what we're thinking about, right? So you put the food in your mouth and how does it feel? But another surprise from our observational study was that some kids didn't like the texture on their hands, that they didn't want to touch foods with certain textures, foods that were squishy, for example, or slimy. And sometimes actually the solution was very simple, that parents just gave them a toothpick or a fork and they could pick up the food without touching it, and then they were happy to eat it. So there may be other ways that foods can be adapted. We also saw some parents freezing foods that were squishy so that they weren't as squishy. Or you can slice things like a mushroom that's squishy, you can slice it thinly so it doesn't squish anymore. So there may be ways that you can adapt things even without changing really the preparation so much. Children can also, you can let them play with the food. I know this is something that as children we weren't allowed to do. You have to eat neatly. But if you play with the food, if you touch the food, even touching other non-food objects that have different textures, soap bubbles and gooey things, that can help children become more familiar with these textures and more likely to accept trying these foods in the future. So it may have nothing to do actually with the food at all, why children are refusing to eat. It may be nothing to do with the food or its sensory properties or its nutritional content. It may be because they're toddlers and they want to have some independence. They're just learning to be little people and have their place in the world, and they want to make some decisions. They don't get much control over life. Parents tell them what to eat and what to wear and when to go to bed. And one of the ways that they can be a little bit independent is they can say no. So if you give them a choice, if you say, eat your broccoli, the choice is to eat your broccoli or say no. So the only way they can be independent is to say no. But if you say, would you like to eat some bell peppers or some snap peas? They can make a decision. They can choose between these 2 healthy options. They've still had their independence, they've still gotten to give some opinion, but they still eat a vegetable. So this can be one thing you can try. Another solution is you can involve the children in the meal preparation process, whether that's the gardening, the shopping, or the cooking. And once they've kind of been involved in this process, they feel some ownership for the meal. They say, I made that, and then they're willing to try it. Now, I know all of you are suddenly having a reaction. You're saying, no, but cooking is too dangerous for small children. This is the question I always get. And there's many things that you can do in the preparation of food that are not dangerous, that they're not scary, okay? Don't give them the knives, don't put them at the stove, but you can stir things, you can wash vegetables, you can put toppings on top of a pizza or assemble a salad. My friend's son is marinating some meat. So I had a audience member at my last talk who says that she has her child wrap wontons. So there's many things you can do that involve no heat or sharp objects that even very young children can start doing. Now, our last category is the less enjoyment of eating or smaller appetite. I'll admit, this one, it's a bit difficult to quantify whether this is accurate. When parents say my child doesn't like eating or my child has a small appetite, there's not really an objective way to measure this or check, right? It's really just her perception of this. So what we would recommend in this situation is, as you heard in the last talk, to provide mealtime structure in a pleasant environment. So by structure, just to remind ourselves, so we want to have regular meal times that the child can anticipate when the next meal will come. They know that if you eat lunch, eat what you want for lunch, and that the next snack will come in this many hours, that they can anticipate this. It's not so much that if they say, I'm not hungry now, and then in a half hour they ask for more food, that there'll be more food available. To make a clear delineation between mealtime and other activities, we want to put away the toys, we want to sit at the table, turn off the screens, really make mealtime about mealtime, because there may be other activities that are more fun and that you'd rather be doing, and we want to make sure that those aren't competing with the child's attention. We want to create a pleasant mealtime environment and make sure that the meal is not stressful. I know for parents it can be stressful for them if they're worried that the child is not eating. They'll want to insist that the child eat, but this can make the mealtime stressful for the child and create negative associations with the mealtime setting in general. So then they might say, when I come to the table, then stressful things happen, and that this is not a situation that I want to be in. So we want to keep the environment pleasant. We don't want to make a big deal if the child refuses the food, to just move on and try again another day. And again, kids eat more when they're hungry. So we want to avoid offering snacks and beverages with energy right before meal times. We see this quite a lot, that parents, they're still cooking, the child say, I'm hungry, and so they just hand them some crackers and say, here, this will hold you over. And then, of course, a half hour later, the child's not hungry. So if we can, as we heard earlier, it's okay if they're hungry for a half hour. They won't starve to death in a half hour. And if they really wait till the mealtime, they're more likely to eat the foods that you're hoping they'll eat. So to recap, the main things I would recommend if you have patients who come in and the parents ask you what to do with their picky eater, first, to remind them to keep trying. As we know, parents give up when the kids don't try a food a few times. Of course, it's frustrating to keep cooking something that your child doesn't like, but keep trying, and don't just keep trying the same way, but prepare it a different way. Vary the taste, vary the texture. Hopefully you can find a preparation that your child will accept. Model eating the foods. So sit together as a family, eat together. If the parents are eating and if the older siblings are eating the food, your child will want to try them. And this is also a way to make it a little bit less frustrating to keep trying. If it's a family food, if everybody's eating it, it won't go to waste because you're eating it too. Provide choices when you can, and involve your children in food preparation. This will maybe take a bit longer, it will be a little bit messy, accept this as part of the process. It's also a bonding experience with your child. Take that as just a fun activity that you can do together. And finally, to make sure that these meal times are structured but relaxed. We want this to be an enjoyable experience for the whole family, and that your child will learn in this relaxed atmosphere. So I'd like to thank our collaborators who worked with us on this research, and I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll open this for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fries. I'm sure there are some questions. Yes, please, Salvador.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you for your presentation. It's very neat. And there's this notion about kids having hunger. And I use it a lot, like in obese kids in my obesity clinic, and it's drinking water. Because at some point, water is like very obnoxious sense, a very obnoxious feeling, and kids will really, relax with a good hydration. And in Mexico, lunch is taken after school, around 2 to 3 o'clock. So it's quite late, and they're really hungry and thirsty and tired. So water is kind of suits for my obese patients. But how about small kids? Have you figured anything about water at this level, like, I don't know, quencher or hunger quencher, if it's allowed at term?
I haven't looked at this explicitly. I know it is actually, I'm hearing more and more, I guess more in an anecdotal way, but that some people actually mistake thirst for hunger, that people think they're hungry, but actually they are just thirsty, and if you drink some water, then that need goes away. And I don't know when kids learn that, and I think that's an interesting question, is when children are learning the difference between what feels like thirst and what feels like hunger, and if that's something that's being maybe mistaught at some point. But I haven't explicitly looked at this in kids, if we can give them a glass of water to hold them over to meals. I would assume just having the feeling of something in the stomach, at least from a volumetric approach, that would work, at least on a short term, but that passes through quite quickly. So, thank you.
You told there is a regular meal time, but should we stick on to the regular meal time or when the child is hungry? Because sometimes the child may not be hungry, and then the mother, looking at the watch, they try to force, and in that process child becomes more averse, it develops aversion to food. And the second thing is the presentation of the food. Sometimes if the child doesn't like a particular vegetable or a fruit or anything, I think we can make it more, presentation should be more attractive to the child, and probably they will like it. The third thing is the conflict between the parents. Because we have seen some families wherein when the child eats, the parents start fighting, and the environment itself
Yes.
has a psychological effect on the child, and it becomes more difficult for the child to take food. So what's your comment on?
Oh, now I have to remember all three parts. I'll start with the last one, actually, because that relates to this pleasant mealtime environment. So that's not just about pressuring the child to eat or not, but also just the general environment. So if the general environment is mom's fighting with dad, or they're yelling at you about your grades, or whatever, whatever the stressful situation is, that can make the association with sitting at the dinner table unpleasant, and the child won't want to come back. So I think this is something, in general, we want to make sure that the mealtime environment stays pleasant, not just talking about the food, but also just generally how people are interacting at the table. It's difficult to enforce. You can't say, okay, now, husband, you can't fight with me at dinner time. It's for the good of the children, but I mean, you can try. So that is a challenge, I know. In terms of the eating on a schedule, so when we say, meals should be offered at regular schedules, this means that meals are offered on a regular schedule. It doesn't mean that children are forced to eat on a regular schedule. So if lunch comes around noontime, lunch should be offered at noontime. And if the child's not hungry, they don't have to eat at noontime. But that there won't be another meal until, when snack time comes at 2 or 3. So I think it's just that the child can anticipate when the next food will be offered, that they're able to decide, do I need to eat now, or should I wait till later, and to make that judgment. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Two concerns. First is with regard the rampant use of what we call here in the Philippines an oral nutritional supplement, which is actually a 1 calorie per meal preparation. I'm sure you're familiar with the brand. It is kind of abused by a lot of mothers and pediatricians. In your opinion, what is the exact role of such products in the management of such children? And the second quick question is with regard that video of a father letting her daughter taste the lime or the lemon. It can be two ways. If I may say it in a script form, oh, this lemon is delicious, how I wish my daughter can take it, versus you take this lemon, this is really delicious.
Okay, so I'll first talk about oral nutritional supplements. So in general, in the literature, there's very little evidence. So in general, I'd say picky eating is a normal phase of development. Most picky eaters are not underweight. And there's very little evidence that picky eating within the normal range will result in underweight or stunting or growth problems. And so the need for additional calories, I'd say there's not so much evidence for this for most children. If the child is underweight, if the pediatrician is concerned about their growth, that is when I think there's a moment for an oral nutritional supplement. If it's just a case that my child doesn't like broccoli, this is not the moment for that. And I think actually, especially when it's replacing a meal, so there's some supplements that are meant to be had kind of as a snack or to supplement, and there's some that are meal replacements. And I think these are the particularly concerning ones, that when you're replacing a meal with these supplements, that you're actually taking away a learning opportunity from the child. So if they're having this very sweet milk-based drink, they're not trying a vegetable, they're not eating with the family, they're not having family foods. So I think that actually it could be counterproductive to be giving children this kind of alternative food instead of a meal. And the other question was about whether you should model...
How the father should approach the child with regard to a first-time food.
Yeah, so in general we found that modeling it, so actually eating the food yourself works better. Okay, so if you eat the food, you say, limes, now you try it. That's the best way to do it. There's a few reasons for this. So one, we heard a little bit earlier that maybe the reason children are neophobic is that it may have an evolutionary advantage, right? That once you can walk around and get your own food, that it's better not to eat anything on the forest floor because some of those things are dangerous. So a lot of this whole process of introducing foods into the diet is teaching the child which foods are safe. And so if you eat the food yourself, this is one way of communicating that this food is safe and delicious, right? So if you eat it and then offer it, this is saying this is food, this is safe, this is something that we eat in our culture, and now I offer it to you. If you just talk about it, then they may wonder. So we actually see a lot of parents, eating the baby food. If you can do that, I think that's a very effective way to convince the child to try it. But also talking about the taste of it can also be effective. Yep.
Yes, thank you very much, Lisa. I am Hardin from Indonesia.
Hello.
Do you have any evidence that the picky eating children affect on the nutritional status of the children, like stunting or underweight or obesity?
Yeah, so as I was saying, there's very little evidence for that in the literature, and that there are some kids who are underweight and picky eaters, but I'd say for the most part, there's a lot of kids who don't like vegetables, but they're completely healthy, and so there's, I'd say in most cases, not so much risk of growth problems, and that's really where you should look at their growth trajectory and make that evaluation, rather than on their food preferences.
So if we are not worried about that nutritional status, why we are worried on the picky eating?
Yeah, so this is the thing. So I guess in general, I would say I would consider picky eating not so much a nutritional problem, if we want to put it this way, but more of a mealtime environment inconvenience for families, that it's causing them stress, that parents are worried about the nutritional status, that they don't know what to do when their child says no to their broccoli. So it's really about reassuring the parents, don't worry, they can grow. I'll tell you, I'm a recovering picky eater. My brother is a recovering picky eater, and he's 2 meters tall. So it's still possible to, grow up, get a job, be tall, and not like broccoli. And so to reassure them that it's okay, and then to give them these tips, say, okay, but if the cause of stress is that your child is not eating the same foods as the rest of the family, here's the things you can try.
Excuse me.
Okay, you go ahead.
Some parents recognize, or even doctors are guilty of mistaking picky eating as loss of appetite. In our country, there are a lot of usage or misuse of what they call appetite stimulants. Is there really a true appetite stimulant, or can you comment on this?
I'm not sure that I have seen any evidence about the use of appetite stimulants for picky eating. I think in general as we're doing this review, we were finding that there's some aspects where if you look at the parent report, parents say, my child does this or my child doesn't do that. But when you get the few studies where they've looked at it through observation or weighing the foods, there's no difference. So things like, parents say, my child eats slowly. But if you look at it, and the few studies where they've timed the kids, there's no difference, or it's a difference of a couple minutes. So, it's that the parents are perceiving their kids as taking a really long time, but maybe they have an unrealistic expectation of how fast you should eat a meal. And it may be the same thing for appetite, that I think sometimes parents expect that their children should be eating a lot more food than is realistic for a child of that age. And So when the mom's saying, my kid has a small appetite, it may just be that this is how much a 2-year-old eats, and they don't know what that should look like.
Yeah, lady behind.
Okay, you mentioned as one of your strategies is fading. Is this different from food chaining? Food chaining is one of the strategies that is being employed for patients with selective appetite. No, what they do is to start with a favorite food and then graduate to another kind of food. Is this different from fading?
Yeah, so I think when you're talking about food chaining, you're talking about that you start with one food and then you add a second one and then you move to a third one. So it's a similar concept, but fading is really specifically when you have kind of a ratio between two foods. So like I said, if you have broccoli with cheese on top, then it's broccoli with a little bit less cheese on top, and then it's broccoli with a little bit less cheese, and then it's plain broccoli. So it's not so much about, and then you don't take the broccoli and link it to carrots. You know, it's just this one technique for this one food. But you could then go on to add other foods. In general, they find that it could be difficult the first food you try. That it takes several tries to try this new food, but then as you get to like that one, the next one should be easier, right? So as children get used to just the process of trying new foods and getting to like them, you also then you say, okay, actually now I've realized, after I've had this a few times, it's not so bad, and then you're more willing to try a new one. So I think it's related, if that answers.
Professor Gibney, I think you had, no? This side.
Is there a simple way wherein parents or pediatrician could detect the differences between children who are picky eater, children who are highly selective, and those children with high functional autism or other oral sensory problems?
That's a good question. And actually, if you look at the literature about picky eating, you come up with a lot of studies about children on the autism spectrum. And they tend to fall, I'd say, under this sensory sensitivity category. So it's really an issue with a certain property of the food. So it's not necessarily the food in itself, but the presentation or the texture or the color. And then I think this is something that the child would want to work through with their occupational therapist, going through the process that they might do also for the texture of their shirt or other sensory issues that they may have. In terms of the difference between picky eater or very picky or highly selective, it's also going to depend on how extreme it is and how limited their diet is. So there'll be some kids who only eat white rice, that they have one food in their diet or only candy bars. And in this case, you would need to take a more extreme approach to reintroduce foods to the diet than your average kid who has a few foods that they don't like. So it's, I think, a question of how much intervention would be needed from a clinician, whether that's a dietitian or the occupational therapist, and how much is really just due to developing preferences and kind of a normal variation in what children like.
Because sometimes there are overlapping on this situation, and as a general pediatrician also as well, I would like to more or less advise or what are the clinical points that would determine from one to another if they are really, really highly,
There's no definition for any of these things. This is what we struggle with all the time, unfortunately, is that what is picky and what is selective and what is fussy, they're all kind of the same thing and kind of not defined. So unfortunately, I can't give you anything more precise, but this is one of the things that we, for future research directions, that we would like to have a more universal definition both for picky eating, as well as to have better measures to assess it, both for clinicians and for researchers. Because I've showed you 5 behaviors that we've identified that seem to be quite common in kids with picky eating. Some of these tend to be assessed in the different assessments that people use. So the food fussiness questionnaire and the children's eating behavior questionnaire, they ask a lot about, for example, neophobia and food refusals, but they don't ask anything about sensory sensitivity. So these are things that may be missed in a lot of these assessments, and I think that there could be more specific questionnaires that may address more of these behaviors in the future.
Maybe as a complement to this answer, there are studies in adults showing also or trying to evaluate inflexibility in eating. And I think this inflexive dimension, like being really resistant to changes and preferring to stay on the schedule rather than having changes in the schedule, may be related to autism spectrum also. So this may be also another way of thinking about eating behavior in autism. Yeah. So I think there was a question. Yes.
I'm happy to hear about the good news that picky eaters, you outgrow them. But I was just wondering, though, if there are any studies that would associate picky eaters to developing maladaptive eating patterns like anorexia nervosa or bulimia. That although, noted to be a picky eater, have outgrown it, but later on, of course, there could be multifactorial, but would there be studies that would associate that?
I haven't seen any, but I think the problem is a lot of the studies on picky eating don't follow kids that long. That these things like anorexia tend to come out in the teenage or early adulthood years, and a lot of studies don't follow children for that long. I would say, generally speaking, the reasons that you would not eat a food when you're 2 or 3 would be completely different from why you would not eat a food when you're 16 or 23. And so I wouldn't expect there to be a link between them, but I don't think it's been evaluated. Do you know, Sophie?
Yeah, I think there are a few cases where anorectic patients were picky eaters when being a child. So, but it's not systematically associated, but so it could be related, but rather to anorexia than bulimia. I think it's old work from Jacobi and collaborators.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lisa, for a very interesting topic. My question is related to rewards as an approach. You mentioned earlier that it's not the best recommended approach, especially if it's a food reward. But I also saw in one of your slides wherein there's play reward. Can you further comment on this? And what could be the implication in terms of school setting?
Yeah, so actually I should change that in my slide. I called it play reward when we were doing the study, and I usually change it. So I usually call it a non-food reward. So there's some parents who gave the kid a high five or a sticker or sang a song for them if they ate the food. So these types of rewards, I'd say in the literature, I'd say the evidence is better that they don't have such a negative impact as the food rewards. So if you give a child a sticker to taste a food, that this doesn't make the food less liked in the future the same way comparing it to another food does. So this can be an effective way to get kids to taste foods. We want to encourage parents, if they're going to take this route, that you're rewarding tasting, not finishing. So great job trying the peas, here's your sticker for the day, not you need to finish the food to get the peas, because this is really where you start to override the satiety cues and things like this. And there's something else I was going to say, but it's gone. But in our study for these non-food rewards, we didn't see that it was a particularly successful or a particularly unsuccessful approach. It didn't really come out in any special way. So I wouldn't say that this was an amazing approach to take, that you should do this instead of, try the peas, or instead of modeling, that the other techniques worked better.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Can you comment on parents becoming short order cooks when they prepare meals, a different meal from what they already prepared?
Yes. So this is something we do see, that parents of picky eaters are more likely to do this, that if the child says, I don't want this, and mom says, okay, I'll make you something else. I think there are questions as to the cause and effect of this, and I think there is maybe a chance that if the child knows they can have something else, they're more likely to refuse the food, right? I was just talking to some colleagues at lunch, and we hear this quite a lot, that parents say, my child eats this food at daycare, but they won't eat it at home. Why is that? And it's because at daycare, you eat this food, or you don't eat it, right? There is no other choice. You know, the teacher has like one plate of food and that's it. She's not going to go in the back and make you a sandwich. This is the meal. And at home, the child knows you have a whole kitchen full of other options, right? And so they know that if they say no to this, that you'll make something else. So I think to the extent that you can make a family meal, that's one meal for everyone. Everybody sits down. These are the 3 or 4 things that are on offer. You offer these to the child and let them pick what they want and how much. I think that's the way to address this, that instead of saying, okay, no, I'll go back and make something else, and try and have among those 3 or 4 things, one thing you know that the child likes, so that there's at least one food that they'll eat, and then hopefully they'll try some of the other things as well. Questions?
Any more questions or comments? No? So, thank you very much, Dr. Fries, for this lecture.
Thank you.